The freedom of the black-faced ram. On the top of Ringwak Hill the black-faced ram stood motionless, looking off with mild yellow eyes across the wooded level, across the scattered farmsteads of the settlement, and across the bright retreating spirals of the distant river to that streak of scarlet light on the horizon which indicated the beginning of sunrise. A few paces below him, half hidden by a grey stump, a green juniper bush, and a mossy brown hillock, lay a white ewe with a lamb at her side. The ewe's jaws moved leisurely as she chewed her cud, and gazed up with comfortable confidence at the sturdy figure of the ram silhouetted against the brightening sky. This sunrise was the breaking of the black-faced ram's first day in the wilderness. Never before had he stood on an open hilltop and watched the light spread magically over a wide, wild landscape. Up to the morning of the previous day, his 3 years of life had been passed in protected, green-hedged valley pastures, amid tilled fields and well-stocked barns, beside a lilied water. This rugged, lonely, wide-visioned world into which fortune had so unexpectedly projected him filled him with wonder. Yet he felt strangely at ease therein. The hedged pastures had never quite suited him, but here, at length, in the great spaces, he felt at home. The fact was that, alike in characters and in outward appearance, he was a reversion to far-off ancestors. He was the product of a freak of heredity. In the fat-soiled valley lands, some 15 miles back of Ringwak Hill, the farmers had a heavy, long-wooled, hornless strain of sheep, mainly of the Leicester breed, which had been crossed years back by an imported Scotch ram of one of the horned, courageous, upland, black-faced varieties. The effect of this hardy cross had apparently all been bred out, save for an added stamina in the resulting stock, which was uniformly white and hornless. When, therefore, a lamb was born with a black face and blackish-grey legs, it was cherished as a curiosity, and when, in time, it developed a splendid pair of horns, it became the handsomest ram in all the valley, and a source of great pride to its owner. But when black-faced lambs began to grow common in the hornless and immaculate flocks, the feelings of the valley folks changed, and word went round that the strain of the white-faced must be kept pure. Then it was decreed that the great horned ram should no longer sire the flocks, but be hurried to the doom of his kind and go to the shambles. Just at this time, however, a young farmer from the backwoods settlement over behind Ringwak chanced to visit the valley. The sheep of his settlement were not only hornless, but small and light-wooled as well, and the splendid horned ram took his fancy. Here was a chance to improve his breed. He brought the ram for what it was worth to the butcher, and proudly led him away over the hills and through the great woods towards the settlement on the other side of Ringwak. The backwoodsman knew right well that a flock of sheep may be driven, but that a single sheep must be led. He held his new possession securely by a piece of stout rope about 10 feet long. For an hour or two the ram followed with exemplary docility, quite foreign to his independent spirit. He was subdued by the novelty of his surroundings, the hillocky, sloping pastures and the shadowy solemnity of the forest. Moreover, he perceived in his dim way a kind of mastery in this heavy-booted, homespun-clad, tobacco-chewing, grave-eyed man from the backwoods, and for a long time he felt none of his usual pugnacity. But by and by the craving for freedom began to stir in his breast, and the blood of his hill-rolling ancestors thrilled towards the wild pastures. The glances which, from time to time, he cast upon the backwoodsman at the other end of the rope became wary, calculating, and hostile. This stalwart form striding before him was the one barrier between himself and freedom. Freedom was a thing of which he knew, indeed, nothing. A thing which, to most of his kind, would have seemed terrifying rather than alluring. But to him, with that inherited wildness stirring in his blood, it seemed the thing to be craved before all else. Presently they came to a little cold spring bubbling up beside the road and tinkling over the steep bank. The road at this point ran along a hillside, and the slope below the road was clothed with blueberry and other dense shrubs. The backwoodsman was hot and thirsty. Flinging aside his battered hat, he dropped down on his hands and knees and beside the spring and touched his lips to the water. In this position, still holding the rope in a firm grasp, he had his back to the ram. Moreover, he no longer looked either formidable or commanding. The ram saw his chance. A curious change came over his mild yellow eyes. They remained yellow, indeed, but became cold, sinister, and almost cruel in their expression. The backwoodsman, as he drank, held a tight grip on the rope. The ram settled back slightly till the rope was almost taut. Then he launched himself forward. His movement was straight and swift, as if he had been propelled by a gigantic spring. His massive, broad-horned forehead struck the stooping man with a terrific force. With a grunt of pain and amazement, the man shot sprawling over the bank and landed half-stunned in a clump of blueberry bushes. Dazed and furious, he picked himself up, passed a heavy hand across his scratched, smarting face, and turned to see the ram disappearing among the thickets above the road. His disappointment so overcame his wrath that he forgot to exercise his vigorous backwoods vocabulary, and resumed his homeward way with his head full of plans for the recapture of his prize. The ram, meanwhile, trailing the length of rope behind him, was galloping madly through the woods. He was intoxicated with his freedom. These rough, wild, lonely places seemed to him his home. With all his love for the wilderness, the instinct which had led him to it was altogether faulty and incomplete. It supplied him with none of the needful forest lore. He had no idea of caution. He had no inkling of fear. He had no conception of the enemies that might lurk in thicket or hollow. He went crashing ahead as if the green world belonged to him, and cared not who might hear the brave sound of his going. Now and then he stepped on the rope and stumbled, but that was a small matter. Through dark strips of forest, over rocky tangled spaces, across slopes burned barren, his progress was always upward until, having traversed several swampy vales and shadowy ravines, towards evening he came out upon the empty summit of Ringwak. On the topmost hillock he took his stand proudly, his massive head and broad curled horns in splendid relief against the amber sky. As he stood, surveying his new realm, a low bleat came to him from a sheltered hollow close by, and looking down, he saw a small white ewe with a newborn lamb nursing under her flank. Here was his new realm peopled at once. Here were followers of his own kind. He stepped briskly down from his hillock, and graciously accepted the homage of the ewe, who snuggled up against him, as if afraid at the loneliness and the coming on of night. All night he slept beside the mother and her young in the sheltered hollow, and kept no watch because he feared no foe. But the ewe kept watch, knowing well what perils might steal upon them in the dark. As it chanced, however, no midnight prowler visited the summit of Ringwak Hill, and the first of dawn found the great ram again at his post of observation. It is possible that he had another motive beside his interest in his new, wonderful world. He may have expected the woodsman to follow and attempt his recapture, and resolved not to be taken unawares. Whatever his motive, he kept his post till the sun was high above the horizon, and the dew-wet woods gleamed as if sown with jewels. Then he came down and began to feed with the ewe, cropping the short, thin grass with quick bites, and finding it far more sweet than the heavy growths of his old pasture. Late in the morning, when pasturing was over for the time, the ram and the little ewe lay down in the shade of a steep rock, comfortably chewing their cud, while the lamb slept at its mother's side. The ram, deeply contented, did not observe two grey-brown stealthy forms creeping along the slope, from bush to rock, and from stump to hillock, but the ewe, ever on watch, presently caught sight of them, and sprang to her feet with a snort of terror. She knew well enough what a lynx was. Yet, for all her terror, she had no thought of flight. Her lamb was too young to flee, and she would stay by it in face of any fate. The ram got up more slowly, turned his head and eyed the stealthy strangers with grave curiosity. Curiosity, however, changed into hostility as he saw the ewe's perturbation, and that the strangers were foes, and a sinister glitter came into the great gold eyes which shone so brilliantly from his black face. Seeing themselves discovered, the two lynxes threw aside their cunning and rushed ravenously upon what they counted easy prey. They knew something of the timorous hearts of sheep and had little expectation of resistance, but being, first of all, hungry rather than angry, they preferred what seemed easiest to get. It was upon the lamb and the ewe that they sprang, ignoring the ram contemptuously. One thing which they had not reckoned with, however, was the temper of the ewe. Before one fierce claw could reach her lamb, she had butted the assailant so fiercely in the flank that he forgot his purpose, and turned with a snarl of rage to rend her. Meanwhile, the other lynx, springing for her neck, had experienced the unexpected. He had been met by the lightning charge of the ram, fair in the ribs, and hurled sprawling into a brittle, pointed tangle of dead limbs sticking up from the trunk of a fallen tree. Having delivered this most effective blow, the ram stepped back a pace or two, mincing on his slender feet, and prepared to repeat it. The lynx was struggling frantically among the branches, which stuck into him and tore his fine fur. Just in time to escape the second assault, he got free, but free not for fight, but for flight. One tremendous, wildly contorted leap landed him on the other side of the dead tree, and, thoroughly cowed, he scurried away down the hillside. The ram at once turned his attention to the ewe and her antagonist, but the second lynx, who had not found his task so simple as he had expected it to be, had no stomach left for one more difficult. The ewe was bleeding about the head and would, of course, if she had been left to fight it out, would have been worsted in a very short time. But the enemy felt the weight of her blows upon his ribs, and had learned his lesson. For just a fraction of a second he turned and defied the ram with a screeching snarl. But when that horned, black, battering head pitched forward at him, he bounded aside like a fairy grey ball and clambered to the top of the rock. Here he crouched for some moments, snarling viciously. His tufted ears sat back against his neck and his stump of a tail twitching with rage, while the ram minced to and fro beneath him, stamping defiance with his dainty hooves. All at once the big cat doubled upon itself, slipped down the other side of the rock, and went gliding away through the stumps and hillocks like a grey shadow. And the ram, perhaps to conceal his elation, fell to grazing as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The ewe, on the other hand, seeing the danger so well past, took no thought of her torn face, but set herself to comfort and reassure the trembling lamb. After this, through the slow, bright hours, while the sun swung hotly over Ringwak, the ram and his little family were undisturbed. An eagle, wheeling in the depths of the blue, looked down and noted the lamb, but he had no thought of attacking so well-guarded a prey. The eagle had a wider outlook than others of the wild kindred, and he knew from of old many matters which the lynxes of Ringwak had never learned till that day. There were other visitors that came and glanced at the little family during the quiet content of their cud-chewing. A weasel ran restlessly over a hillock and peered down upon them with hard, bright eyes. The big ram, with his black face and huge curling horns, was a novel phenomenon, and the weasel disappeared behind the hillock, only to appear again much nearer, around a clump of weeds. His curiosity was mingled with malicious contempt, till the ram chanced to rise and shake his head. Then the weasel saw the rope that wriggled from the ram's neck. Was it some new and terrible kind of snake? The weasel respected snakes when they were large and active, so he forgot his curiosity and slipped away from the dangerous neighbourhood. The alarm of the weasel, however, was nothing to that of the wood mice. While the ram was lying down, they came out of their secret holes and played about securely, seeming to realize that the big animal's presence was a safeguard to them. But when he moved, and they saw the rope trail sinuously behind him through the scanty grass, they were almost paralyzed with panic. Such a snake as that would require all the wood mice on Ringwak to assuage his appetite. They fairly fell backward into their burrows, where they crouched quivering in the darkest recesses, not daring to show their noses again for hours. Neither weasel, nor wood mice, nor the chickadees which came to eye him saucily, seemed to the big ram worth a moment's attention. But when a porcupine, his quills rattling and bristling till he looked as big around as a half-bushel basket, strolled aimlessly by, the ram was interested and rose to his feet. The little, deep-set eyes of the porcupine passed over him with supremest indifference, and their owner began to gnaw at the bark of a hemlock sapling which grew at one side of the rock. To this gnawing he devoted his whole attention, with an eagerness that would have led one to think he was hungry, as, indeed, he was, not having had a full meal for nearly half an hour. The porcupine, of all nature's children, is the best provided for, having the food he loves lying about him at all seasons. Yet he is forever eating, as if famine were in ambush for him just over the next hillock. Seeing the high indifference of this small, bristling stranger, the ram stepped up and was just about to sniff at him inquiringly. Had he done so, the result would have been disastrous. He would have got a slap in the face from the porcupine's active and armed tail, and his face would have straightway been transformed into a sort of anguished pincushion, stuck full of piercing, finely barbed quills. He would have paid dear for his ignorance of woodcraft, perhaps with the loss of an eye, or even with starvation from a quill working through into his gullet. But fortunately for him, the ewe understood the peculiarities of porcupines. Just in time he noted his danger, and rudely butted him aside. He turned upon her in a fume of amazed indignation, but in some way she made him understand that the porcupiner was above all law, and not to be trifled with even by the lords of the wilderness. Very sulkily he lay down again, and the porcupine went on chiselling hemlock bark, serenely unconscious of the anger in the inscrutable yellow eyes that watched him from the ram's black face. When the shadows grew long and luminous toward evening, the ram, following some unexplained instinct, again mounted the topmost point of Ringwalk and stood like a statue gazing over the vast, warm-coloured solitude of his new domain. His yellow eyes were placid with a great content. A little below him, the white lamb wobbling on weak legs at her side, the ewe pastured confidently, secure in the proved prowess of her protector. As the sun dropped below the far-off western rim of the forest, it seemed as if one wide wave of lucent rose-violet on a sudden flooded the world. Everything on Ringwalk, the ram's white fleece, the grey bleached stumps, the brown hillocks, the green hollows and juniper clumps and poplar saplings, took on a palpitating aerial stain. Here and there in the distance the coils of the river gleamed clear gold, and overhead, in the hollow amber and lilac arch of sky, the high wandering nighthawks swooped with a sweet twang of smitten strings. Down at the foot of the northern slope of Ringwalk lay a dense cedar swamp. Presently, out from the green fringe of the cedars, a bear thrust his head and cast a crafty glance about the open. Seeing the ram on the hilltop and the ewe with her lamb feeding nearby, he sank back noiselessly into the cover of the cedars and stole around toward the darkening eastern slope, where a succession of shrubby copses ran nearly to the top of the hill. The bear was rank, rusty-coated, old, and hungry, and he loved sheep. He was an adept in stalking this sweet-fleshed, timorous quarry, and breaking its neck with a well-directed blow as it dashed past him in a panic. Emerging from the swamp, he crept up the hill, taking cunning advantage of every bush, stump, and boulder. For all his awkward-looking bulk, he moved as lightly as a cat, making himself small, and twisting and flattening and effacing himself, and never a twig was allowed to snap or a stone to clatter under his broad, unerring feet. About this time it chanced that the backwoodsman, who had been out nearly all day hunting for his lost prize, approached the edge of the forest at the other side of Ringwalk, and saw the figure of the ram against the sky. Then, seeing also the ewe with the lamb beside her, he knew that the game was his. Below the top of the hill there was not a scrap of cover for a distance of perhaps 20 paces. The bear crept to the very last bush, the ram being occupied with the world at a distance, and the ewe busy at her pasturing. Behind the bush, a thick, spreading juniper, the bear crouched motionless for some seconds, his little red eyes aglow, and his jaws beginning to slaver with eagerness. Then, selecting the unconscious ewe, because he knew she was not likely to desert the lamb, he rushed upon his intended victim. The ewe, as it chanced, was about 35 or 40 feet distant from the enemy as he lunged out, black and appalling, from behind the juniper. At the same time, the ram was not more than 20 or 25 feet distant, straight above the lamb, in a direction at right angles to the path of the bear. The ewe looked up with a startled bleat, wheeled, sprang nimbly before the lamb, and faced her doom dauntlessly, with lowered head. The ram's mild gaze changed in a flash to one of cold, yellow savagery at the sight of the great black beast invading his kingdom. Down went his conquering head. For just a fraction of a second his sturdy body sagged back, as if he were about to sit down. This, so to speak, was the bending of the bow. Then he launched himself straight down the slope, all his strength, his weight, and the force of gravity combining to drive home that mighty stroke. The bear had never, in all his experience with sheep, encountered one whose resistance was worth taking into account. The defiance of the ewe was less than nothing to him. But as he saw from the corner of his eye the huge bulk plunging down upon him, he hesitated, and half turned, with great paw upraised for a finishing blow. He turned not quite in time, however, and his defence was not quite strenuous enough for the emergency. He struck like lightning, as a bear always can. But just before the stroke could find its mark, the ram's armed forehead crashed into his ribs. The blow, catching him as it did, was irresistible. His claws tore off a patch of wool and skin, and he ploughed red furrows across the ram's shoulder. But the next instant he was sprawling, his breath jarred from his lungs, against a stump some 10 feet down the slope. As the bear struggled to his feet, furious but half daunted with amazement, the ram danced backward a pace or two on his nimble feet, as if showing off, and then delivered his second charge. The bewildered bear was again caught unready, irresolute as to whether he should flight or flee, and again he was knocked headlong, a yard or two further down the slope. His was not the dauntless spirit that most of his kindred would have shown in such a case, and he would willingly have made his escape at once if he had seen his way quite clear to do so. But at this moment, while he hesitated, he heard a man's voice shouting loudly, and saw the tall backwoodsman running towards him up the hill. This sight turned his alarm into a blind panic. His feet seemed to acquire wings as he tore madly away among the thickets. When he was hidden by the leafage, his path could still be followed by the crashing of dry branches and the clattering of loosened stones. The woodsman had seen the whole incident, and was wild with enthusiasm over the prowess of his prize. Bears had been the most dreaded scourge of the settlement sheep farmers, but now, as he proudly said to himself, he had a ram that could lick a bear silly. He bore no grudge on account of his discomfiture that morning beside the spring, but rather thought of it with appreciation as a further evidence of his favourite's cunning and prowess, and he foresaw, with a chuckle, that there were painful surprises in store for the bears of the Ringwalk range. He had made a wise purchase indeed when he saved that splendid beast from the butcher. Hearing the man's voice, the ram had halted in dismay just when he was about to charge the bear a third time. He had no mind to go again into captivity. But, on the other hand, for all his lordliness of spirit, he felt that the man was his master. At first he lowered his head threateningly as if about to attack, but when the backwoodsman shouted at him there was an authority in those tones which he could not withstand, and he sullenly drew aside. With a good-natured laugh the man picked the lamb up in his arms, whereupon the mother stepped timidly to his side, evidently having no fear. The man rubbed her nose kindly, and stroked her ears, and gave her something from his pocket, which she ate greedily. And, as the ram looked on, the anger gradually faded out from his yellow eyes. At length the man turned and walked slowly down the hill, carrying the lamb. The ewe followed, crowding as close to him as she could, and stumbling as she went because her eyes were fixed upon her little one. The ram hesitated. He looked at the hillside, the woods, and the sky, beginning to grow chill with the onrush of twilight. Then he looked at the retreating figures. Suddenly he saw his world growing empty and desolate. With an anxious bleat he trotted after the ewe, and took his docile place a few feet behind the man's heels. The man glanced over his shoulder, and a smile of pleasure softened his rugged face. In a few moments the little procession disappeared in the woods, moving toward the settlement, and Ringwalk Hill was left solitary in the dusk, with the lonely notes of the nighthawks twanging over it.